Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marinka Twilt, and as the annual meeting committee chair, it is my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce the next two speakers. Luckily, they made it really easy for me because they're going to introduce themselves. So I just have to say, in the spirit of collaboration, I think it is great to hear how CARRA actually started. So I'll hand it over now to Yuki and Laura for their presentation on CARRA Past, Present, and Future.
Thanks, Marinka. So I'm going to get started. Can I have the next slide, please? So I am the Division Chief of Pediatric Rheumatology and Professor of Pediatrics at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital at Hackensack Meridian School of Medicine and a lifelong CARRA member. And I'm really delighted to introduce my co-presenter, Laura Schanberg, who is a professor of pediatrics at Duke and a leader of CARRA, who co-chairs the CARRA Research and Registry Oversight Committee with me. So it's appropriate that Laura and I are doing this talk together because while it may seem to you and probably to us like we've known each other forever, we really only met through CARRA and have gotten to be friends through CARRA. We actually met at one of the initial CARRA meetings, and I followed her through leadership positions in CARRA, including being president of CARRA and co-PIs of the CARRA Registry since its creation. So we were asked to give a talk about CARRA's past, present, and future in 55 minutes or less, and to make it interactive while being remote on Zoom, which seems totally impossible, because this is really a talk that should be presented in person. And we would have wanted to be with all of you and see all of you and call on people and be informal, but we can't really do that. So what we did was the next best thing, which was to ask a few people to record short talks ahead of time. So we're going to play these videos during our presentation, and we can pretend that we're in a room together. Next slide.
So thank you, Yuki. We decided to center the talk today around major inflection points for CARRA over the years. And we think that this is important right now and appropriate because we believe that CARRA is at a major inflection point right now. And we'll talk more about that as we go. But the big inflection points have been its creation, its first major grant, the CTP and CARRA Registry formation, incorporation, the Arthritis Foundation Partnership, creation of the IROC. Partners was the grant that really got us going with patient engagement, establishment of the CARRA Registry and our biorepositories, and then, of course, COVID, which has been an inflection point for everybody, and the growing pains and change that go along with maturation of an organization. Next slide.
So we thought it would be very appropriate to invite Betsy Mellons and Christy Sandborg to give our first little mini talk because they were really instrumental in starting CARRA. And CARRA actually happened through their sheer determination and will. So they're going to talk to us about where we started as a subspecialty in the late 90s and and the reasons why CARRA started. So let's see the video.
So it's really a pleasure to get to revisit the early days of CARRA and talk to Christy about the way we got it so excited. So Christy?
I came to Stanford in 1997 and Betsy had been there for a year. I came to Stanford from Southern California because I was really worried about pediatric rheumatology. I had done research in cytokines and cytokine inhibitors, and I knew there was amazing new biologic medicines coming down the pike called TNF inhibitors that were being tested in adults. And I thought these would be transformational, perhaps, in kids with arthritis. And in fact, they were, which is really also very exciting. But I also recognized that we had so few pediatric rheumatologists in the nation that less than 50% of patients were being taken care of by pediatric rheumatologists, that only 60% of medical schools even had one pediatric rheumatologist, and that we were graduating so few fellows a year that when I was sitting on the American Board of Pediatrics at about the same time, we heard the rumor that they were going to start offering our boards because we only were graduating an average of 7 people a year into pediatric rheumatology. And so Betsy and I started working together, and Betsy was transformational in getting us to this new into this new space. So Betsy.
Thanks. Well, I think it was clear to all of us that we were going to need to work together. And in fact, in order to preserve the field and in order to move the field forward. And in fact, we already were working together, but in a very informal way, because there were so few of us that we all turned to each other when we had patients that were keeping us up at night. And so when I went to a meeting that the Arthritis Foundation sponsored to talk about a potentially transformative gift that the WASI Foundation in Minneapolis was going to give to the Arthritis Foundation, specifically earmarked for pediatric rheumatology, I was really taken with Brian Feldman's idea that the best way to use that was to try to actually formalize the way we were working together and to try to get to come together as a research network, particularly focused on investigator-initiated research, since we all had questions. We weren't lacking in questions, but we were lacking in mechanisms to work together to answer them.
So we had many centers, but in each center there was only one or two people at most, and nobody had enough patients to combine. PRCSG, headed up by Dan Lovell and Ed Giannini, had been doing amazing work in putting together trials for these new biologics and other medications that were coming. But it became clear that we needed to have a mechanism where everybody could learn and work together.
Yeah, I think when we started looking around at other networks and how they functioned, and we focused mostly on pediatric networks, one of the other things that became clear was that they were also training grounds for people, that they were an infrastructure that allowed people to learn how to do research and also gave them the tools to do research. And that was another thing we wanted to emulate as we designed our network.
So we held our first meeting in Palo Alto, and Ed and Dan were there to help us every step of the way. And we learned about other networks, and we decided with a few other, Carol and Norm and some others, to take the next step. And at our next meeting, which was held in Chicago, with Ed cleverly coming up with some money for us to meet, we had about 25 to 30 pediatric rheumatologists there. We also invited the Arthritis Foundation and NIAMS, and that led to us really formulating our principles and the basics of our infrastructure and how we were going to function. And one of the biggest principles was that every pediatric rheumatologist, most of us, of course, are in academic centers, could actually participate in the research.
Yeah. Yeah, I think another component was to be talking to NIAMS and understanding what we would need to do to get some backing, because we knew that the most robust networks out there were also backed by the NIH. And Susanna Serrata-Stein was really influential and very helpful, explaining that what we needed to come with were actually trials, and that what we needed to show, it isn't really trials, but it's research projects, and that what we would need to show was that, unlike some adult rheumatology units, that we were going to need a little bit more help with actually funding the infrastructure. But if our questions were good, she was pretty sure that we'd be able to get support. So Christy, you got support.
Yeah. And so when we met in Chicago, that first meeting, this was like 2001, I think. We actually, with the Arthritis Foundation scientific director who was there, who actually gave CARRA its first grant, and Betsy and Ed Giannini put that first infrastructure grant together. And Susanna told us about this new RFA that had come out on innovative therapies, and Laura Schanberg and I started putting together the Apple trial, which, as you know, was funded and took off. And I think the rest is history.
What I was just going to say is that I think we listened to the people who were telling us what we needed to do to get credibility. And I think that was really important, because we knew that it wasn't just joining together to be a community, although that was key and important, but that we needed to show pretty quickly that we could do something. And I'm just really proud of the whole organization that's what happened.
Thank you. So Yuki, they sort of gave away this question here, but
not really.
No, I'm thinking about the next question.
No, just go on.
Yes, sorry. So Yuki, do you remember what CARRA's original name was?
Yes, although most of you probably don't know that CARRA had a different name when we first started. But it definitely wasn't Apple. And it was PRRN, which stands for Pediatric Rheumatology Research Network. But then we Googled it, and we had Google in those days even, or maybe something else. But we couldn't keep that name because the initials were already taken by a US designated terrorist group. And so we had to find a different name, which was CARRA eventually. But this was the cover page of the first proceedings of the PRRN to be CARRA. Next slide. So we dug up this picture of most of the participants of that initial meeting, which I believe was in 2001. Laura and I met there for the first time, and we've talked about this meeting since and how surprised we both were to be invited to this meeting, because I certainly didn't know, most of the people except from a distance, and we both felt incredibly intimidated and not deserving to be in this august group of pediatric rheumatologists.
Talk about imposter syndrome.
Next slide.
This is our original org chart for CARRA. It was designed on a poster board with a lot of crossing out. What is notable about it, though, is that even from the very beginning, we were designed as a research organization with a protocol evaluation committee, the research subcommittee structure, DSMB, et cetera. Next slide. These are the original guiding principles back from 2001. And I won't read through them all, but but of note, they are really the same as our guiding principles today. Next.
And we, of course, want to credit Balu Athreya, who you see pictured here. He was one of the pioneers of pediatric rheumatology, with really leading us to create these guiding principles. So thank you, Balu. Next slide. So the next question was, what was CARRA's first major research study?
And obviously everybody now knows what that is, because Christy gave it away, but it was the Apple study. And Christy and I were the PIs on that initial study, which was, next slide, did some important science. We showed that premature atherosclerosis occurs in pediatric lupus from an early age, that it's really significant, higher rates than in familial hypocholesterolemia, and that statins are safe. Next slide. But even more important, we learned, next slide, click. that it takes a long time to get started for study startup. And we tried to put into effect for moving forward ways to centralize and make study startup quicker. Next. In addition, we learned that recruitment is an art, that with this study, the recruitment rates of patients approached per site were anywhere from 6 to 70%, but we learned that we could teach people to do it. Next slide. And basically, we learned that we can do this. And even though from the moment I walked into the DCRI and had 20 people sitting around me at a table, looking to me to guide them through how to do this clinical trial, we, in fact, working as a community, were able to make it happen. Next slide. So Yuki, which of these projects were funded by the NIH era grants?
So actually two were actually funded, and these were the CARRA Legacy Registry and the CARRA CTP program. So basically, the two major game changers for CARRA were created as a result of these ARA funding, and really spurred the development of CARRA forward. Next slide. So next, Brian is going to speak, Brian Feldman, and we asked him to give us some context for the rationale for developing the consensus treatment plans, or CTPs, to be used in observational comparative effectiveness research, and why this is so important for rare diseases like ours. Can we play the video?
Hello, everyone. Yuki and Laura have asked me to shortly describe the evolution of the consensus treatment plans in the CARRA network and registry, and I suppose my involvement in them. Up until I heard the late, great Yale epidemiologist Alvin Feinstein speak at the ACR, I had been only interested in randomized controlled trials and planned to spend my entire career doing that. But Alvin Feinstein pointed out many, many years ago that randomized controlled trials were expensive, difficult, and often studied highly select populations, and he had suggested that perhaps there was a better way if we could use the kind of data we collect in our charts, observationally collected data, and do really good observational studies, we might be able to provide evidence for treatments that were as robust as we get from randomized trials. Now, of course, at the time he suggested this, we weren't able to do that because our treatments were often confounded by indication, and any comparison would be highly biased. However, shortly afterwards, great statisticians and scientists like Judea Pearl from UCLA, Donald Rubin, James Robbins, and Miguel Hernan from Harvard developed a new set of tools called causal methods that could be used for observational data. These had been developed and used for large data sets like large health services research data sets and in economics. And the challenge was how to use it in our rare diseases. And to me, that seemed to be exactly what CARRA was designed for, to take advantage of natural and random practice variation in order to draw robust inferences about treatment effects. However, the practice variation when we're dealing with small numbers of patients was so huge that it didn't seem to offer us a way forward using the standard methods that were proposed. So, for example, from Elizabeth Stringer's paper, this is in dermatomyositis, and you can see that even for typical moderate dermatomyositis, there were many different regimens in place. And even when we just think about the corticosteroid use, there were many different regimens, so that if we put them all together, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of combinations and permutations that would have to be compared. So we came up with an idea of developing, similar to what the cancer folks had done a generation before, treatment plans that we could pull off the shelves that would allow us to stay fairly true to what our initial plans had been, but to reduce the amount of practice variation. And so Adam Huber in his publication presented for dermatomyositis the 3 consensus treatment plans that we had come up for standard, moderate severity dermatomyositis. And using that and the methods that have been developed and extending on the methods, talented statisticians like Quan Lu and others have been able to show that we can exactly provide the same kind of rigor that we get from randomized trials to the observational study of treatments from our CARRA registry. And this is, of course, from the pilot study from dermatomyositis patients. And we were able to apply even more sophisticated methods to the STOP JIA study, and will continue. Now, of course, the challenge is not to see what happens at the end of 6 months of different treatment plans, or even a year or 2. The whole point of this is to see whether the treatments that we're using can be shown to be superior in the long term for the long-term outcomes of our patients. And we're there now. Although this process has been going on for at least a dozen years, we're now in the place where we have moderate to long-term outcomes collected in the CARRA registry, where we can apply these causal methods and the extensions of the causal methods to looking at treatment efficacy in our rare diseases. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So you can see that this NIH ERA grant really provided the structure and the funding for the development of the CTP process, which you see pictured here. And from the initial CTPs for 4 pediatric rheumatic diseases came CTPs for many other diseases, as you all know. And most importantly, a way for every pediatric rheumatologist to be able to participate in the research process, which really generated a lot of excitement and enthusiasm amongst our members. And I think that excitement persists to this day. Next slide.
So the other cornerstone was the CARRA registry. And the need for a registry was first uncovered in 2001 when the disease-specific committees were created and met for the first time and determined, each of them individually, that they wanted a registry to be able to move forward research in rheumatology. Jeff Siegel at the FDA later approached Christy and Yuki to help them co-sponsor a workshop on whether a disease-specific registry was feasible for safety surveillance. And then in 2010, we started CARRAnet, which funded the initial CARRA Legacy Registry. To move forward from that, we incorporated CARRA in 2014, in which case we were then able to take funds directly from companies to perform phase 4 pharmacosurveillance studies, and the new registry began. Next slide. And this just shows the amazing growth of the registry over time. And the growth in numbers and data is terrific, but it goes along with escalating costs as well. And that's sort of the downside of our success. Next slide. With the registry thriving and the CTPs in place and us having data now, we were ready to start doing comparative effectiveness research, which is why this was all done to begin with. Next slide.
So STOP JIA was actually a study that did all that, put those things together. So this was the first large-scale comparative effectiveness research project of CARRA CTPs that were funded by PCORI in 2016. And through this grant, we were able to compare the effectiveness of the CARRA CTPs for polyarticular JIA. And through these, we asked the question of whether biologics should be started early or only after DMARDs have failed. Next slide. The primary results, which you see kind of pictured here, looked at disease outcomes, especially disease inactivity after 12 months. And they showed that there was a definite trend of better outcomes in patients who were started on biologics early. And we are continuing to learn more about longer term outcomes through the registry, because these patients will be followed in the registry for 10 or more years, which is so important, as Brian pointed out, to learn about the effects of this initial treatment over longer periods of time. Next slide. So the next question is then, when did CARRA start providing intramural grants? Do you know the answer?
Well, this is a tough one. And we thought we knew the answer. And then we've been corrected that we didn't really know the answer, but I think it's about 2016. And we're going to see whether our next speaker agrees with that date. Please play the next video, next slide. Sorry, next slide, and please play the next video.
Thanks to Laura and Yuki for inviting me to say a few words about the role of the Internal Research Oversight Committee, or IROC, within CARRA. I've been the chair of the IROC since it was formed in 2018. The IROC is responsible for overseeing CARRA's grant program, including developing new requests for applications and allocating research funds. The CARRA grant program started in 2016, and at the time, the primary research opportunities were one-year small and large grants, which were intended to fund pilot studies and be a stepping stone to funding external to CARRA. Over the last several years, with the critical support of the Arthritis Foundation, and after assessing the needs of the CARRA community, we've expanded the amount of funding and length of time for CARRA's small and large grants, and have also created several new grant mechanisms, such as the health equity, implementation science, and career development opportunities, which have been offered this past year. The IROC is committed to ensuring that our research portfolio meets the needs of the pediatric rheumatology community. As within the larger CARRA infrastructure, the IROC will need to adapt to some of the current challenges that CARRA is facing, including diversifying funding streams. I believe our research program is essential to the continued success of CARRA as we continue to support pediatric rheumatology research, including both individual investigators as well as collaborative research, and the spectrum of research from bench to bedside. I want to conclude by thanking the current IROC members who are listed here, and invite anyone who's interested to self-nominate for participation in our committee. If you want to have an impact on the future of the CARRA research portfolio, please consider joining us.
Thanks, Amy. I guess 2016 was right. Moving on to the next CARRA milestone or inflection point was when we committed to patient engagement in research. And Vincent Del Gaizo, as many of you guys know, had been talking in our ear about this for a long time. And honestly, Yuki and I sort of always brushed him off about this, not understanding the power of engaging patients in research. But it is part of our goal to take advantage of different funding opportunities. Essie Morgan and Mark Natter and Vincent came to me and asked me to collaborate with them in putting in a PCORI grant, Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute grant called Partners, which was a joining collaboration between the Arthritis Foundation, PR Coin, CARRA, and CureJM and the LFA. Next slide. So while getting involved with this actually totally turned my perceptions of the importance of patient engagement and helped us bring this to become a normal within CARRA, Melanie Coleman is going to talk to us about what this means from the patient point of view. Please start the video.
Hi, I'm Melanie. I'm a JIA nurse, and I'm here today to talk about my experience in patient engagement within CARRA. My daughter was diagnosed in 2012. In 2013, I became involved in PR Coin. Through my involvement in PR Coin, I was invited in December of 2014 to join in on a PCORI-funded PPRN, or Patient-Powered Research Network, called Partners. Partners was formally linking the Arthritis Foundation, CARRA, PR Coin, CureJM, and LFA to bring more patient voices to research in rheumatology. Thanks to the Arthritis Foundation and Partners, starting in 2015, we were finally able to start inviting more parents and patients to the CARRA annual meeting. That year in Austin, we had about 12 parents and patients attend the CARRA annual meeting. I sat in on lots of sessions at that meeting, but one that stuck out to me was the JIA inactive disease session, where the providers were having a discussion around tapering or discontinuing biologics and other medications, and there was no real consensus among the pediatric rheumatologists. They admitted that they really didn't know what was best. And I sat there as a parent who had a kid who was currently inactive, and I thought, if you don't know, how are we as parents supposed to make decisions about stopping medication? Do we know how often kids flare after they stop meds, and can we get them back under control on the same meds if they do flare? And so I raised my hand. And the rest is history. I now find myself in study leadership on several research projects within CARRA and outside of CARRA. Several research questions were born from me raising my hand in that session, and I look forward to continuing this hard work with the JIA committee. Fast forward to our last in-person CARRA annual meeting, and we had over 70 parents and patients in the room. This is just a snippet of about 40 or so of us who attended that meeting, and we look forward to being face-to-face again in the future. Since this last face-to-face meeting, we've also formed a Registry Parent-Patient Advisory Committee led by myself and Emily New, right there down in front. I want to share that we are so grateful as parents and patients. CARRA has offered parents and patients seats at the table. We are valued, appreciated, and respected. Lots of us are involved in study leadership, on CARRA work groups, and CARRA leadership. There are way more of us than there are of you, so please let us help. I know I can speak for everyone in the community when I say thank you for including us in your family.
Thanks. Can we have the next slide? So this is just a summary of the major milestones that we've gone through so far. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through it all. Can we have the next slide? So we're going to go through a series of very short clips from different investigators, because we want for everyone to understand that they can pursue specific research interests if through the registry and leveraging the registry by really pursuing their interests and obtaining funding. Next slide. So the first study is SCORE, and Cassie Tarak is going to talk about their funding from the Scleroderma Foundation that allowed them to leverage the CARRA registry. Can we play the video?
Hi, everybody. This is Cassie Tarak from the University of Pittsburgh. Yuki and Laura invited me to give you a short talk about being a trailblazer through the SCORE study. So the SCORE study was a large grant through the National Scleroderma Foundation in collaboration with CARRA to determine the immunophenotype of juvenile localized and systemic sclerosis. So the goal was basically to collect a large biorepository as well as detailed clinical data longitudinally in a subset of patients to determine the immunophenotype of scleroderma in children. So we enrolled 18 sites, and in the end, 15 were able to supply specimens and clinical data, as you can see on the graph on the side. And we got our total enrollment to be 105 patients, which is great, 57 localized scleroderma and 48 systemic sclerosis. And they will each have 5 time points where data in biological specimens are collected. We're already up to 7,000 aliquoted specimens in our freezer. So really excited to share this as a resource for investigators currently and in the future as well. So they did want me to mention that this was a process, though. We hit a few road bumps along the way, but it actually, in the end, ended up working for future people going through this. So using the CARRA infrastructure, we wanted to, Suzanne Lee and I wanted to institute REDCap. It's a little more flexible than RAVE as far as if we want to add or drop some variables, but still feed into I2B2. So we work very closely with Mark Natter and Min Lee to make this happen, as well as Laura Schanberg and Dennis and other people in the CARRA leadership. And now we have other disease groups using REDCap database, and about to roll out is the REDCap cloud for CARRA. So we were kind of a trailblazer in that aspect. And another process change that has occurred over the years of us doing the SCORE study is there was a kind of a holdout at the Duke IRB with this small SCORE amendment for the CARRA Registry, kind of hanging out for 18 months, despite Ann Denos, Laura Schanberg, and myself and Suzanne Lee like really pushing. So lessons learned, other disease groups have also experienced that. And now there is a central IRB that CARRA is using. So that also ended up being in a positive way. So I think the bottom line is you can do great things using CARRA infrastructure, but you also, many of the time, if you're doing a big study like this, would need outside funding as well. But then a lot of perseverance, persistence, and then, CARRA is behind you all the way. They might be working in the background, but we, work together to make it happen. I'm really proud of this study and the biorepository that we're building up, and I'm excited for future investigators to take advantage of this. Thank you for your time, guys.
Thank you, Cassie. Next, we're going to hear from Dan Horton talking about the Recapture JIA study, which he co-PI'd with Sarah Ringgold and was funded by the RRF. Video, please.
I had the pleasure of working on the Recapture JIA project, led by Sarah Ringgold and funded by the Rheumatology Research Foundation. This project used CARRA Registry data to answer the question for those with JIA who experienced flares after stopping DMARDs. What were the rates at which they could reattain inactive disease, and what were the predictors of those favorable outcomes? This was a hard project to do during the pandemic, like many. Prospective enrollment and data collection was more challenging. Getting biospecimens for kind of exploratory biomarker work really didn't happen. But that said, we were grateful to have enough data in the registry to answer our main question. Grateful for the contributions of so many investigators and coordinators to the registry. And I think in the end, we were able to produce actionable evidence that will help inform shared decision-making, serve as useful preliminary data for future projects and grants. There's also, I think, a really nice opportunity to work with a talented collaborative team of clinical and translational researchers, parent researchers, project and data managers and analysts that I think shows the power and the potential for using these resources to answer important questions. And I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Dan. Next, we're going to hear from Grant Schuler, who is going to be talking about his current study using a large grant to enroll and study systemic JIA patients with lung disease. Can we play the video, please?
Hello, I'd like to briefly share with you today how we've been able to use the CARRA Reaches Registry and other aspects of CARRA infrastructure to build a multi-site translational research network to study lung disease and systemic JIA. This clinical problem, while increasingly recognized over the past decade, still remains quite rare, with most CARRA members and centers only following at most a couple of patients with this condition, which highlights the need for multi-site collaborations to understand both the disease course and trajectory of this disease, as well as obtain the necessary biosamples for translational research. So the solution to this was using the CARRA resources. We obtained a CARRA Arthritis Foundation large grant to be able to launch a cohort study nested within the CARRA registry. We worked together with more than 20 CARRA sites who follow patients with systemic JIA and lung disease to have them be able to enroll patients into this cohort. And along with typical registry data, we built a supplemental data capture tool through REDCap Cloud, which is able to capture lung disease specific information that's not directly queried in the existing registry. In addition, we're able to collect biosamples that are housed at the CARRA bio repositories in Toronto and Cincinnati. Moving forward, we enrolled the first patient in this cohort in July 2021. As of this month, we now have more than 20 patients enrolled in the cohort, the majority of them of whom we've also obtained biosamples. And we're currently applying for future funding to be able to extend and support this study.
Thanks, Grant. Thank you, Grant. Next, we're going to hear from Joyce Chang talking to us about a really interesting study looking at lupus, race, and demographics. And this is the part of a CARRA AF Health Equity Award. Please start the video.
Numerous population-based studies have demonstrated that children from minoritized groups have worse lupus outcomes. What we don't really know is what's happening at the local levels to perpetuate these disparities or to create differential risks within minoritized groups. CARRA has a new funding mechanism called the Health Equity Grant, which is enabling our team to utilize the Childhood Opportunity Index to better understand local context. And so our objectives are to determine how neighborhood opportunity levels influence outcomes of childhood lupus. And rather than focusing solely on the concept of race, we're trying to bring racism into the scientific discourse. We know that structural racism often determines where people live based on their race. And as you can see here, all the yellow dots representing Black children are highly concentrated in the lowest opportunity areas of the Boston metro area. And in contrast, all of the green and orange dots are concentrated in the highest opportunity areas. And so our second objective is to determine how racial and ethnic disparities in lupus outcomes are potentially modified by residential segregation patterns and also neighborhood opportunity levels. And to do this, we are linking hospital administrative data and outcomes with EMR data about disease activity and other demographic characteristics, and then using street level data to map to census tracts and child opportunity. We're doing this at 3 different sites with our CARRA investigators, and then pooling this data to assess differential risks based on opportunity and segregation patterns. And so we are very fortunate and grateful to have support from CARRA to pursue this work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joyce. Next, we're going to have Mara Becker speaking about an exciting new development that you'll all be interested in, through which we'll be able to obtain MOC Part 4 points by participating in a CARRA Registry project. Can we have the next video?
After long efforts, I'm happy to report that the CARRA Registry specific MOC Part 4 project has been approved by the American Board of Pediatrics just last week. So hot off the presses. I know we've been talking about this now for a couple of years, and COVID kind of deterred us for a bit, but I'm really happy to report that the large scale QI project application was accepted by the ABP. And so now we have some opportunities to offer MOC Part 4 credit through your activities in the CARRA Registry. So the overall aim of the project, of course, is focused on critical variable completion. And our offering cites the opportunity to participate in 1 or 2 projects associated with critical variable data completion. So you can choose improvement in the global aim, which encompasses the physician global and the patient or parent global, or you can participate in the lupus aim, which includes the calculable SLEDAI score and the physician global variables. And so you can also participate in both if you want. You can get 25 points of MOC Part 4 points for each project that you participate in. Our goal is to close the gap, essentially. So the gap between what would be 100% completion and what your site is currently completing. This is really exciting news, and I think a real opportunity to be able to dovetail both our research efforts as well as clearly our certification needs as pediatricians. And so hopefully this work will be meaningful to folks and will find a renewed vigor into being involved in the CARRA Registry. Our goal is to start soliciting interest from sites over the next month or so. And so please be on the lookout for some emails to sign up if you're interested. We will have a kickoff meeting this summer, and our goal is to start the cycle in September of 2022. If this takes off and if people find it valuable, we can continue to add, and maybe even one day CARRA can be a portfolio site. So I think this is just a great start to a new horizon for the CARRA Registry, and we welcome your involvement.
Great. Thanks so much, Mara. I think that these are just a few of the projects that have leveraged the CARRA infrastructure and registry, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity here for all of you to be able to do the same. So just switching gears a little bit, I think it goes without saying that the last few years have been an incredible challenge for all of us, personally and professionally, and just as much for CARRA as an organization. But we hope that this will eventually be a good thing and will provide CARRA with opportunities for growth and renewal.
Hey, Yuki, isn't there something Christy always talks to us about? Some psychological.
Right. So she introduced us to this term of this concept of post-traumatic growth, which is really the idea that out of stress, the stress of change and trauma, can come renewal and even metamorphosis, an ability to break out of the shell of the models that we've been using. And this is, we think, a concept that is applicable to CARRA right now. Next slide. So when we put this talk together and looked at this picture of the initial group and started naming all the people, we realized that every chair and president of CARRA to this day are in this picture. Next. But that is changing. So Emily stepping down as president in July, she will be the last founding member of CARRA to be on the executive committee. Next slide. So there are many changes that are happening to CARRA. There are changes in leadership of major committees, with Bob Culver taking over as the new president and Nora Singer taking over as the chair of the Grant Review Committee and many other committees. And very importantly, are coming changes in registry leadership. So as we speak, Laura and I are stepping down from the registry and handing it off to Mara Becker and Mary Beth Sun. Next slide. We've had major organizational and staff changes as well, which have led to CARRA having a CEO for the first time. Next slide. And there are also leadership changes at our major partner, the Arthritis Foundation. Next slide. So COVID has certainly had a major impact on all of our lives. And it's not only that, we do things remotely and on Zoom, but so many things are changing as we grow into a larger and more mature organization. The leadership is changing, the way we do research is changing, and the way CARRA is organized, grows, and functions is changing. Next slide.
So as Yuki and I have shared many glasses of wine and Aperol spritzes and talked about the future of CARRA, these are topics and some of the things that we know are happening to CARRA and actually we have been looking forward to. Our maturation into a staff-led organization to try to streamline the way decision-making occurs within the organization is greatly needed and I think looked forward to by everybody. We have just finalized and had accepted by the board of directors a new strategic plan, which has been mentioned at this meeting before, but we're also working on developing as a group a strategic plan for the registry and for the biorepository. And neither one of these have really had formal strategic plans before. The research agenda will continue to be directed by the membership. And in fact, the elected leadership of CARRA will have more time to spend thinking about this and less time to spend thinking about the operational details that we've had to think about in the past. The board of directors is providing fiscal responsibility, and we are lucky to have a very invested group on our board. We are now gotten to a place where we don't need to just be thinking about creating infrastructure and growth measured that way. One of the key inflections here is to rethink how we think about growth and thinking about how we leverage the infrastructure that we have in order to grow. This will include more translational research, and CARRA has already made commitments to this. And then, of course, is team science. And CARRA has been doing team science before it was a buzzword. We have always done team science, but our emphasis on team science needs to continue. And I think and Yuki and I think is vital to the ongoing success of the organization. Next slide.
So let's end this presentation. We wanted to do a word cloud, and we would like you to participate in this and go to this website, use this code, and type in what word comes to your mind, when you think of CARRA, and we'll show you the end product in a few slides. Next slide.
One second. Is this on the in the chat box? We can't tell. Is this being put up somewhere so as we keep talking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So while you're thinking about it, we'll tell you what CARRA means to us, which is not just a single word, obviously, but what we think of when we think of CARRA is really a community. It gave Laura and me a community of pediatric rheumatologists with whom to develop relationships, opportunities, and friendships, and a way to collaborate in meaningful research, as well as with our patients and families. And importantly, to develop partnerships. Next slide.
All kinds of partnerships. These are just pictures from our partnership with the Arthritis Foundation, our single most important partner. Next slide. But also we have global partnerships. Most of these pictures represent meetings with folks from press. Next slide. But most of all, it means friendships. And these are just pictures of friends. And in particular, Yuki and I wanted to shout out to Norm Illowhite, who is circled here. And he has been an influential person, both to Yuki and I personally and professionally, and for CARRA. And we miss him. Next slide.
So here we're supposed to see the completed word cloud, but I'm not sure. I'm not seeing it.
Do we have a completed word cloud?
Yeah, I'm sure they're working on it.
It's up on the screen. Okay.
Okay.
But we can't see the screen.
So I guess we can't comment on it.
Ah,
okay. Awesome. So, this is obviously most of you are from the new generation of pediatric rheumatologists, and this is still changing, but I think that, some of our thoughts, hopefully you all share with us and will help us lead us into the next era of CARRA.
Next slide. Next slide, please.
Oh, it's because it's going from the app to the slide.
Oh yeah, there's a delay. They warned us about that. So CARRA has had good times. Next slide,
show the next slide.
So CARRA has had good times and bad times over the years and has faced many challenges along the way. CARRA is a dynamic organization. It's not like the ACR or any other organizations that we belong to. It is here for us as long as we make it so. You know, most importantly, what CARRA has always relied on is to face challenges and new opportunities as they arise as a group with our friends and our colleagues. And it's our relationships that is what has led to CARRA's success. And that includes listening to the people who know, as Betsy Mellon said at the very beginning. Next slide. CARRA's real secret sauce is you. Right.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It was really a pleasure to speak to all of you.
It was. And to speak with you, Yuki.
Thank you.